Venezuela is often described as a country destroyed by external pressure, but the truth is more complex. For decades, Venezuela relied almost entirely on oil revenue, creating the illusion of endless wealth. When oil prices were high, deep structural problems were ignored, weak institutions, growing corruption, and political power concentrated in a few hands. Instead of strengthening production and accountability, the state expanded control while dismantling independent oversight. When oil prices fell, the system collapsed rapidly. What followed was not a sudden disaster, but the exposure of long-hidden failures that had been building quietly for years. The economic crisis in Venezuela did not arrive overnight. It unfolded through a series of policy decisions that slowly dismantled the country's productive capacity. Strict price controls and currency restrictions were introduced to protect consumers, but instead they discouraged production and drove businesses into bankruptcy. As imports became harder to finance, shortages spread across every sector, from food to basic medicine. Hyperinflation followed, erasing salaries and savings at an unprecedented speed. A monthly wage could lose most of its value within days. For ordinary Venezuelans, money stopped functioning as a reliable tool of exchange. Survival replaced planning. The social consequences were devastating. Hospitals lacked essential supplies, schools struggled to operate, and public services collapsed. Families were forced to skip meals, sell personal belongings, or rely on informal networks to survive. Crime increased as economic desperation grew. What makes this crisis particularly severe is that it occurred in a country with vast natural resources. The collapse exposed a painful reality: economic mismanagement and institutional failure can overpower even the greatest material wealth. As the economic situation deteriorated, political power in Venezuela became increasingly centralized. Key institutions that once provided oversight, the judiciary, the electoral authority, and the legislature, gradually lost their independence. Decisions that shaped the country's future were no longer subject to meaningful checks and balances. Elections continued to take place, but their credibility was widely questioned, both domestically and internationally. Opposition figures faced legal pressure, disqualification, or detention, narrowing the political space for dissent. Public demonstrations, often driven by economic hardship, were met with security forces rather than dialogue. Control over media also tightened. Independent outlets closed or were forced into self-censorship, limiting access to alternative information. In this environment, fear and uncertainty became tools of governance. Power was maintained not through public trust, but through institutional control. The result was a political system increasingly disconnected from the daily reality of its citizens, deepening the divide between the state and society. In recent years, Venezuela's crisis has moved beyond its borders, becoming a regional and international concern. Diplomatic tensions intensified as foreign governments questioned the legitimacy of elections and imposed sanctions aimed at pressuring political change. The government, in turn, framed these measures as the primary cause of the country's suffering, using external threats to reinforce internal control. International mediation efforts have produced limited results. Dialogue between the government and opposition has repeatedly stalled, undermined by mutual distrust and shifting political interests. Meanwhile, Venezuela has strengthened ties with a small group of strategic allies, reshaping its foreign policy around survival rather than integration. Border disputes and migration pressures have added another layer of instability. Neighboring countries face the economic and social impact of millions of Venezuelan refugees, while tensions periodically flare over security and resources. What emerges is a nation caught in a geopolitical struggle, where internal collapse intersects with global power dynamics. The crisis is no longer only Venezuela's problem, it has become a test of how the international system responds to prolonged state failure. Venezuela's vast oil reserves were once seen as a guarantee of national prosperity. Instead, they became a central factor in the country's decline. The state oil company, once among the most efficient in the world, was gradually politicized. Technical expertise was replaced by loyalty, and transparency gave way to secrecy. Billions of dollars in oil revenue flowed through opaque channels with little public accountability. Investigations by international bodies and journalists have pointed to large-scale corruption involving senior officials, contractors, and financial intermediaries. Funds intended for infrastructure, maintenance, and social programs were allegedly diverted or lost through mismanagement. As investment declined, production fell sharply, reducing the very income the state depended on. This created a vicious cycle. Falling oil output limited government resources, while corruption weakened public trust and institutional capacity. Ordinary citizens paid the price through shortages, unemployment, and deteriorating services. Oil, rather than being a tool for development, became a source of concentrated power and personal enrichment. The Venezuelan case reveals a critical truth: natural resources do not protect a nation from collapse when governance fails. Without accountability, even the richest reserves can deepen inequality and accelerate systemic breakdown. Venezuela's collapse is not the result of a single event, but of years of unchecked power, economic mismanagement, and institutional decay. Its story is a warning: without transparency and accountability, wealth becomes a liability, and a nation's greatest strengths can turn into its deepest vulnerabilities.